I have always been the invisible twin, not because I was smaller or quieter, but because I was the safety net. While Leo chased adrenaline and empty promises, I built a life out of discipline and sweat. I am a software architect. I worked 80-hour weeks to secure a reputation that carries weight in this city. My name, Elias Thorne, stands for reliability. Leo's name? It stands for unpaid tabs, and I'll pay you back next Tuesday. My parents always told me to be the bigger person. They told me that family is a bond you never break, even when that bond feels like a noose tightening around your neck. I remember the day I realized how much I had actually achieved. I bought my first apartment, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the skyline. I invited the family over for a celebration. My mother spent the entire evening talking about Leo's new business venture, which was really just him selling overpriced supplements out of his trunk. I stood there, holding a glass of vintage wine I'd earned, feeling like a ghost in my own home. I was the provider. I was the one who paid for Mom's knee surgery and Dad's gambling debts. Yet, when I looked in the mirror, I saw a man who was only valued for his bank account. Leo looks exactly like me. We share the same sharp jawline, the same deep-set hazel eyes, and the same cowlick on the left side of our heads. But while I spent my 20s in libraries and server rooms, Leo spent his in bars and back alleys. He has a way of tilting his head and flashing a boyish grin that makes people forget he's a habitual liar. He calls it charm. I call it a weapon. For years, I let him sharpen that weapon on my patience. I thought if I gave him enough chances, he'd eventually choose to be a man instead of a shadow. That was the moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday evening when I got the first notification. A credit card application was denied. Then another. I checked my credit score, and my heart dropped into my stomach. It had plummeted 300 points in a single month. Someone was opening accounts in my name. Someone was taking out personal loans, buying high-end electronics, and leasing a car I'd never seen. I sat in my darkened living room, the blue light of my laptop reflecting in my eyes, and I felt a cold shiver of realization. I knew that signature. I knew those spending habits. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to think a stranger had hacked me. A faceless criminal in a basement halfway across the world would be easier to handle than the truth. I called Leo. He didn't pick up. I called my mother, and she sounded flighty, defensive. She mentioned how well Leo was doing lately, how he'd finally found a career that suited his talents. My blood turned to ice. She knew. They all knew he was wearing my life like a stolen suit, and they were letting him do it because it was easier than dealing with his failures. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it erased me. I went to my bank the next morning, and the teller looked at me with suspicion. She told me I'd already been in 3 times that week to withdraw cash. I showed her my ID, and she compared it to the security footage. There he was, my brother, wearing my favorite charcoal blazer, signing my name with a flourish I'd practiced since grade school. He wasn't just stealing my money. He was stealing my reputation, my history, and my future. He was becoming me so he could destroy me. I felt invisible, not just to my family, but to the world. If Leo could walk into my bank and be me, who was I? I spent the next week tracking the damage. He had leased a luxury SUV. He had rented an apartment in a neighborhood I couldn't even afford to live in. He was living a life of absolute decadence on my dime, while I sat in my office trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding without destroying my family. I still had that lingering, poisonous thought, he's your brother. But the brother I knew died the moment he used my social security number to bail himself out of a gambling debt. I found the paperwork in his trash after I used my spare key to enter his new apartment. The place was littered with high-end shopping bags and empty champagne bottles. On the counter sat a pile of mail addressed to Elias Thorne. My name, my life, my ruin. I picked up a photograph of us from when we were kids, and I realized he hadn't just taken my identity, he had cannibalized it. The emotional collapse was a slow, agonizing burn. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected a debt collector or a process server. I felt like I was walking through a dream where I was screaming, but no one could hear me. I went to my parents' house, hoping for a shred of sanity. I found them sitting on their porch, looking happier than I'd seen them in years. Why? Because Leo was finally successful. Because Leo was taking them out to fancy dinners and buying them gifts. Elias, you should be happy for him, my mother said, her voice dripping with that forced sweetness she used when she was lying to herself. He's finally found his feet. He even mentioned he might be able to help you out if your work slows down. I stared at her, my jaw aching from how hard I was clenching it. He was buying their love with my stolen sweat. He was a hero, and I was the bitter, jealous twin who couldn't handle his brother's success. I tried to tell them. I pulled out the bank statements. I showed them the fraudulent loans. My father didn't even look at the papers. He just sighed and shook his head. Don't be like this, Elias. Don't let your ego ruin this family. Leo said you were going through a rough patch and might try to sabotage him. I didn't want to believe him, but look at you. They had already been poisoned. Leo had anticipated my move and turned my own parents against me. I was a villain in a story I hadn't even written. I realized then that I was completely alone. My parents weren't just victims of his manipulation. They were accomplices. They preferred the beautiful lie of Leo's success over the ugly truth of my struggle. I stood up and walked out of that house without saying another word. I realized that as long as I played by the rules of family, I would always lose. To save myself, I had to stop being a brother and start being a hunter. I had to let the man I loved die so the man I needed to be could live. The discovery of his grand finale came a few days later. I found a confirmation email for a massive business loan, nearly $500,000, using my primary residence as collateral. He was going for the kill. If that loan went through and he vanished, which I knew he would, I would lose everything. The apartment, my savings, my credit. I would be a ghost with a mountain of debt. He wasn't just skimming off the top anymore. He was burning the whole house down with me inside. I spent 48 hours straight in my home office, fueled by black coffee and a cold, vibrating rage. I contacted the fraud department of the bank, but I didn't ask them to stop the transaction. Instead, I asked for the details of the closing dinner Leo had organized to celebrate the deal. He had invited the bank's executives and our parents to a high-end steakhouse. He wanted a grand stage for his final act. He wanted to be the man of the hour before he disappeared into the night. I felt a strange sense of calm as I gathered my evidence. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like an architect. I designed a plan with the same precision I used for my software systems. I contacted the local police department's white-collar crime unit. I spoke to a detective who had been tracking a string of identity thefts in the area. When I showed him the proof, his eyes widened. "He's not just your brother," the detective said. "He's a professional." I realized that Leo had done this before. Not to me, but to others. Small-scale scams that I'd helped him cover up over the years. I had been his enabler. By protecting him, I had groomed a monster. This wasn't just about my money anymore. It was about stopping a predator. I provided the detective with the time and location of the dinner. I told him exactly how it would go down. I wanted Leo to feel the full weight of the identity he had stolen. I wanted him to see the face of the man he thought he'd erased. The strategic comeback began with a transformation. I didn't go to work. I didn't answer my parents' frantic texts about why I was being so difficult. Instead, I went to the finest tailor in the city and bought a suit that matched the one I knew Leo would be wearing. I got my hair cut exactly like his. If he wanted to be me, we were going to give the world 2 Elias Thorns. I wanted the confusion to be absolute. I wanted the moment of revelation to be a psychological shatterpoint. I called the bank executive who was supposed to attend the dinner. I didn't claim to be Elias Thorn. I told him I was an investigator looking into a massive fraud case involving the Thorn accounts. I told him to proceed with the dinner, but not to sign a single document. He's going to try to get you to finalize the loan over dessert. I warned. When he does, look for the man at the bar. The executive was hesitant at first, but when I sent him the police report and the forged signatures, his voice turned to ice. I spent the afternoon of the dinner in a state of zen-like focus. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is messy. Revenge, when done right, is a surgical procedure. I walked into the restaurant 30 minutes before the reservation. I sat at the bar, positioned in the shadows, where I could see the main table. I watched the waitstaff set the stage. White linens, Sparkling crystal, the scent of expensive cigars. It was a stage set for a king. Little did Leo know, it was actually a gallows. I watched my parent arrive first. They looked radiant. My mother was wearing a diamond necklace I knew she hadn't bought herself. My father was laughing, slapping the back of a man I didn't recognize. They looked like they'd finally gotten the son they always wanted. It hurt to see them so happy on a foundation of lies, but that hurt was a final thread snapping. I was no longer their son. I was a stranger watching a play. Then he walked in. Leo, he was glowing. He moved with a confidence that I had never possessed, a swagger born of absolute lack of conscience. He was wearing my blazer, my watch, and my name. He greeted the bank executives with a firm handshake, my handshake. He sat at the head of the table like a conqueror. I sat at the bar, sipping a glass of water, watching my life being performed by an actor who didn't even understand the script. The dinner was a masterclass in manipulation. I could hear snippets of his conversation from across the room. He spoke about our vision for the future, about the hard work I'd put into the firm. He was using my struggle to sell his scam. My parents beamed at him, nodding along as he told stories that were actually mine, but twisted to make him look like the hero. I felt a surge of nausea, but I pushed it down. The trap was set. The police were already in position at the entrance. "I think we have everything in order," the bank executive said, pulling a leather-bound folder from his briefcase. This was it, the moment of the signature. Leo reached for his pen, that silver fountain pen I'd received for my graduation, the one he'd stolen from my desk a month ago. He unscrewed the cap with a flourish. "It's a big step for the Thorne family," Leo said, his voice smooth as silk. "But we're ready for it." I stood up from the bar. I walked slowly toward the table, the heels of my shoes clicking against the marble floor. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the restaurant. Leo didn't notice me at first. He was too busy looking at the dotted line. But my mother did. Her face went pale, her eyes darting between me and the man sitting at the table. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. Then my father looked up. Then the executives. Finally, Leo turned his head. The color drained from his face. So fast, I thought he might faint. He looked at me, then at the pen in his hand, then back at me. For a second, the mask slipped. The charming Elias Thorne vanished, replaced by a cornered rat. "Elias?" My father stammered, looking at me, then at Leo. Why are there two of you?" The restaurant went silent. The other patrons turned to stare. The tension was so thick it felt like it could snap the crystal on the table. "There aren't two of us, Dad," I said, my voice calm and steady. "There's me, and there's the man who's about to go to prison." I turned to the bank executive and nodded. The executive pulled the folder back. "I'm afraid the deal is off, Leo. Or should I call you Elias? It's hard to keep track of who's who when one of you is a ghost." Leo tried to laugh it off. He tried to stand up, to play it as a joke. "Elias, brother, you always did have a weird sense of humor." "I'm not your brother anymore," I interrupted. "I'm the victim of felony." At that moment, the two detectives moved in. They didn't make a scene. They were professional, quiet, and devastating. They approached the table and placed their hands on Leo's shoulders. "Leo Thorne, you're under arrest for identity theft, grand larceny, and multiple counts of bank fraud." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. My mother let out a strangled cry. "You can't do this. He's your brother. Tell them to mistake. Elias." She reached out to grab my arm, but I stepped back. My father stood up, his face red with fury. "You destroy your own flesh and blood for money? After everything we've been through?" I looked him dead in the eye. "He didn't just take my money, Dad. He took my life. And you let him. You cheered for him while he was burying me alive." They thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought I was too weak, too good, too burdened by family loyalty to ever strike. They were wrong. As the police led Leo out of the restaurant in front of the city's elite, he looked back at me. There was no charm left, no boyish grin, just pure, unadulterated hatred. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I felt a weight lifting off my chest that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The aftermath was a storm of phone calls and legal battles. My parents tried to guilt me, then they tried to scream at me, and finally, they tried to beg. I blocked their numbers. I moved to a different apartment, one they didn't have the address to. I spent months rebuilding my credit, my reputation, and my sanity. It was hard, and it was lonely, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't a safety net. I wasn't a ghost. I was just me. Leo is serving 5 to 7 years. He reached out to me once from prison, asking for a lawyer. I didn't respond. I sent the letter back to the sender. My parents are still living in the house I paid for, but they don't have the successful son to brag about anymore. They have a void. They chose the illusion, and now they have to live with the silence it left behind. I realize that some bridges are meant to be burned, so you can use the light to find your way home. I sit in my new office today, looking at a nameplate that finally feels like it belongs to me. There's a peace in the air that I never thought I'd find. I used to think that being the bigger person meant absorbing the blows. Now I know it means having the strength to walk away from the people who are swinging. I am Elias Thorne, not the twin, not the provider, just a man who reclaimed his soul from the people who tried to sell it. Sometimes losing your family is the price of finding yourself.